All right, hi, welcome. We're so glad you all could join us today. This session is part of a larger series that's offering mental health and suicide prevention information, support, and resources in response to the global pandemic. I'm Kelsey Schmitz, and I work for the University of Washington at the SMART Center, the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. And I lead the school mental health supplement to the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Our center is located in Seattle, Washington. The Northwest MHTTC and the UW Smart Center are partnering with some amazing Northwest organizations to bring you a series of webinars to provide some virtual learning opportunities for kids, families, and educators that focus on mental wellness and suicide prevention. So those partners include the Forefront Suicide Prevention Center, Association of Washington School Principals, Dr. Jim and Liz Mazza, who created the DBT in Schools curriculum, Northwest Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, Sound Supports, and Well Educator, LLC. Today's session is the second of a series of 3 webinars for school leaders. Next slide. You can learn more about the rest of the Wellbeing series by visiting the website there. That's on the upper right side of this slide. You can also see on this slide the type of opportunities that we have. We have some things that have already occurred, and we have an amazing team that are already posting recordings and materials. So if you've missed something or want an opportunity to watch something again, you can visit the Wellbeing page and check those things out. If you have any questions, you can reach out to my colleague, Megan Lucy, who can help direct you in the right way. Next slide. So the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center was funded by SAMHSA, which stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, in late 2018. And the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. We do know that we have a lot of you that are participating from across the country and outside of our region today, and just want to make sure that you know that you have a regional center in your area that you can also reach out to. But you're always welcome to participate in any events offered by any center. Next slide. So the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center supports the school mental health workforce in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And these are some different ways that you can get in touch with our Region 10 Northwest MHTTC School Mental Health Center. You can check out our website where we post recordings and products and archive our newsletters and have other school mental health resources. You can follow us on social media, and you can sign up for our newsletter. Next slide. So now I'd like to introduce Kurt Hatch. Kurt Hatch is the Associate Director at the Association of Washington School Principals. He's a former teacher and instructional coach, an award-winning principal. Kurt has also served as a leader in a variety of systems here in Washington, including Puyallup, Kent, University Place, North Thurston, and he's also been a leader over in Shanghai, China. He's currently based out of Olympia, and his work includes policy analysis, advocacy, leading the Mastering Principal Leadership Network, and facilitating professional learning topics such as systems improvement, distributed leadership, equity, bias, and race. Kurt also mentors early career principals and trains school leaders on the implementation of school-wide student support system that's helped recapture thousands of hours of instructional time, increase teacher efficacy, and eliminate suspensions, the use of suspensions. We really greatly appreciate the partnership that we have with AWSP to prioritize support for school leaders, and really couldn't be more thankful that they have joined the efforts to bring you this series. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Kurt.
Thanks, Kelsey. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to help get things kicked off today, our content kicked off, and just want to tell you a little bit about the Association of Washington School Principals and why we're so happy to be partners in this effort. What you're seeing there is just our mission statement. That's what we're all about. And we represent about 90% of all assistant principals and principals in the state of Washington. They are members, and they appreciate tools, tangibles, and takeaways. And so we're hoping that we give you, I know that we'll give you quite a few of those today. And our goal as an association, goal number one is around equity. You can see the descriptors there. So part of what we do is focus on things like multi-tiered systems of support to support an equity vision, and particularly with regard to our groups of students and families that have been historically underserved or discriminated against based on race. Our goal too really has to do with something that we call the churn. Only 1 in 4 principals, and this is a national statistic, and here in Washington, only 1 in 4 principals remain in the same building after 5 years. And we know that has an impact on students, families, and the culture, systems, and learning in schools. Next slide, please. So one of the resources that we use with our members across the state and across the nation is something that some of you might be familiar with. It has to do with improvement science. We know that we often get shiny objects kind of thrown towards us in terms of school improvement. We want things to stick and become part of the culture, systems, and learning. And this is a great resource for helping us get to root causes and doing deep level analysis so we can have our improvement efforts stick in our schools. Next slide, please. So like I said earlier, one of the reasons that we're excited to partner is because of folks like you, the people that are showing us that this is really worth your time. Webinar 1, as you can see, the number of registrants and attendees, we're close to that right now. So that tells us that we're giving things to folks out in the field that are topical and timely. This is our second webinar. You can see some of the data around that, and we hope that you will join us for our June 4th webinar. During that time, we'll have some guest speakers as well as the content experts that you'll hear from today. So again, the power of the collaboration. What you'll hear today are folks that have deep knowledge in the areas that are highlighted in that first line. It's been my pleasure to work with all of these folks for many of them a number of years. And so again, AWSP is a proud sponsor of these this webinar series. And we know that together we can do so much out in the field. So I love this partnership essentially. And so to get us started in some of the content, just as a reminder, this webinar is focused on the role of the school leader, but I think it will be topical for everybody that has joined. And our goal is to create and maintain a positive culture, systems, and learning in schools, and do so virtually during the global pandemic and in your building when we start to return back to school. So the objective, there are 3 for this series. 1, describe how trauma, extreme stress impacts our ability to learn and our executive functioning skills. 2, identify guiding ideas and concrete steps that you can take to support teachers, families, or if you're a teacher, you can support your colleagues and families and ourselves emotionally. And 3, identify how the core features of MTSS, including systems, practices, and data, can be shaped to address and build protective factors for the school community now and once students are back in buildings. So we know that the challenges faced by school leaders and all educators are many. And leadership is a very nuanced job with endless details, particularly during this time. And many of you have probably been serving meals or supporting childcare and trying to determine how to do distance learning, all while envisioning the possibilities of how school might look in the future. So we're working during a global pandemic and there's no textbook or guide for how to do this. So we know that it's essential to keep focusing on taking care of ourselves and each other and helping, again, the culture and systems and learning thrive in our context. And for many of us, because the pandemic-induced shutdown, it's been particularly challenging to situate ourselves proximal to the pain of our students and their families. But needless to say, many are struggling. We know this. We're struggling with job loss, food and housing insecurity, traumatic contexts that continue to shift. And anxiety and fear right now are at heights for millions of students, and so many of them are experiencing these mental health trials and tribulations for the first time. So this is why having mental health experts to help inform and guide thinking and how we support our own mental wellness for staff, students, and families is so important. So today you will hear very practical strategies that you can put to use right away. And if you miss some of this, you can get the recordings. And I also just want to put a quick plug in for the AWSP, Association of Washington School Principals Summer Conference that's in the end of June, a virtual conference, because part of some of the folks here today will be part of a pre-conference called Tears for Fears, all about MTSS. So just to close, the need for systems and structures of MTSS has never been more important than it is right now. And as you listen to the presenters, you'll learn how to strengthen and expand your system to be more effective and efficient during COVID shutdown and upon the return to school. So welcome. And right now I'll turn it over to Dr. Lori Linus from Sound Supports.
All right, thank you so much. So we're just going to do quick introductions, and then Jessica is going to jump in with the beginning of our content. So I think we'll take ourselves off or put our videos on so you can see us just for a second, and then we'll keep them off for the rest of the presentation until questions at the end. A lot of this just is that we're dealing with some internet instability, so if we keep our cameras off, that helps to make sure things run smooth. But I'm Lori Linus with Sound Supports. And then we've got with us Cher Anderton, who's also with Sound Supports, and then Jessica Swain Bradway, who's at Northwest PBIS. And I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, who's going to take us in through the start of the series and introduce us just a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Lori. I appreciate everyone taking time to join us today. This is the second in our series for building protective factors for yourself and the school community, and we've specifically tailored these 3 webinars for our administrators. Our title for today is Reentry, Planning Ahead for Coming Back Together. Next slide, please. Who we are. We thought it would be fun to not just talk about the things we've done with our work, but to introduce ourselves in different ways, a little silliness, a little seriousness. So Lori Linus is the executive Sound Supports, a former middle school and high school sped teacher. We have that one in common. She claims she can say every line from the movie Pretty in Pink. We might have a challenge there. And she admits to loving 80s rock. So I love that about her. Cher Anderton is a therapist and MTSS coach, former elementary school counselor. For fun, she just renovated her bathroom, and she claims she can hear the first notes of a song and name it even from her childhood. I think there's some challenges coming up here, my amazing colleagues. I'm Jessica Swain Bradway, the executive director for Northwest PBIS Network. I am a former high school special ed teacher. I am a Star Wars expert, and Lori did challenge me to that. And I'm a big fan of bees. So sorry to Kelsey Schmitz. I believe it's one of her adverse childhood experiences is bees. So we're gonna have a poll question that's gonna pop up here. Lori's gonna take us to the next slide. We'd like to know, what's your role in the district and or school? You'll have multiple options here that you can pick from. Megan's gonna get that poll launched for us, and we'll be able to see that as we go through. There it is. Awesome. Folks respond to that. Great work. Thank you. This is always helpful to see who is on the webinars. Oh, we have a real nice kind of mix here. Got some district coaches. We've got our nice mix across our administrative levels. Got some.
Yeah, and I would just add, if you're not seeing your role on here, you can feel free to chat that to the panelists. We've seen
Excellent.
a couple of folks do that.
Thank you. Helpful prompt there. This is great. Let's advance to the next slide and the next poll, because our next question is, did you attend webinar 1 of this series? Heck yes, I did is winning so far. And then we do have another option, no, but I watched the recording. We appreciate when you take time to do that. Excellent. We've got some repeat customers here. This is really great. Okay, now we have another poll because polls are fun.
Let me share
go ahead and
it real
share.
quick so everybody can see it.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, heck yes, I did one of the solid 68%. This next one is really just a lot of fun. So we want to know what Hogwarts house do you belong to? And if you don't know, that's okay. There is a hyperlink there. You can go to Wizarding World and figure it out. It's okay if you are also a hashtag Star Wars fan or hashtag Lord of the Rings. We're fine with that. I am a fan of all things kind of science fiction-y. Gryffindor is clearly winning. Oh, excellent. Look, and then almost as many people said, I don't know, but tell me how to figure this out. Kelsey will make sure those are posted. And this is just a reminder. One of the things that we're going to point out today is that we can systematize moments of joy, moments of connection, and we probably are in more of a need of that now than ever. So you will absolutely see these types of silly bits throughout the presentation today. So Kelsey's going to post that and Lori will advance us. So let's talk a little bit about our multi-tiered, I got to get these slides off my screen so I can see, our multi-tiered framework. So just as a reminder for those of you who are new to joining us around new to the multi-tiered framework or PBIS or RTI is like our computer's operating system. That's MTSS. Everything gets pushed through the operating system. And if things aren't running smoothly, then we, if our operating system is not up to speed, then we can't run the programs we want to run. So thanks, Catherine Bradshaw, an excellent researcher who brought that to our attention. And Lori's going to take us to our next slide. So when we are thinking about being able to respond thoughtfully to where we are now, being able to celebrate our work right now, plan ahead, we want to make sure we're bringing attention to building or strengthening these different areas that exist in our day-to-day in our organizational structure. So we are specifically focused on trauma responsiveness. And this is more than trauma informed, it's actually response. We are hyper-focused on our social emotional skills and emotional safety. I appreciate that terminology. Our school connectedness, our predictability and consistency. Having when we have our systems in place, it gives us a level of flexibility. And really, as we were pulling this PowerPoint together, we agreed that one of the things we make sure we do is point out throughout this PowerPoint is how our systems support ourselves as adults and shape our behavior so we can support kids. So we have systems that support all of us. And really, when you're thinking about creating a foundation, a transition plan, you're thinking about how you continue to support folks through this year, looking at the strength of your systems is always going to be a winner. And we do that first by thinking about what's a current state or present level of performance, if you will, for our systems. So Lori's going to advance us. Next slide. So we're going to talk about assessment. And really, we have to know where we're going and be able to tell when we've gotten there. So let's do a quick poll. We're going to bring up poll number 4. I would like to know how familiar are folks with MTSS, or core features of MTS, or MTSS in general. Thanks, Kelsey. You're right on top of it. So hold my tear. I've got this. I'm an expert. I could probably fake it in a discussion. We're just getting started. Or please stop it with the acronyms. It's really killing me. Okay, we have got a tie almost between hold my tear and could probably fake it in a discussion. I love the honesty. Just getting started and barely keeping up with the new acronyms. Way to be. Thanks for sharing that information. We're going to do a quick foray into MTSS. We're going to hop on to our next slide. So we have core features, and you'll hear this kind of shop talk a lot around core features, but these are the things that need to be in place. These are the, I don't know, it's kind of like the things you will see. My language is great for a Thursday. So within our core systems for MTSS/PBIS, we call it different things in different areas. We're really talking about our multi-tiered system. We have our effective district leadership team. It's vitally important that this work is being organized at the district level. As some of you are realizing, you knew it ahead of time, and some of you are realizing after the fact, because you're engaging in the problem solving. We want you to have a problem solving protocol, so this isn't on the strength of 1 or 2 people who are like the problem solving Sherpas. Our district team is in charge of crafting and reshaping those policies, and they're using data to do that. And data-based decision making includes the collection, the rigor and integrity of collection, organization, and sharing those data. We know sharing those data is of vital importance to keep that visibility high for the work we're doing and let people see kind of the fruits of their labor. Within our PBS and MTSS systems, we have comprehensive screening. We use those screening data to guide our process for selection and an implementation of evidence-based practices. And remember, we go beyond screening in our multi-tiered system. Right? We have screening through diagnostic. We have different levels or layers of identification of kiddos. And all of that is really helps drive the content within our professional supports. So it is vitally important that we have other systems in place to deliver training, coaching, and feedback to our folks who are the interventionists. Remember, an intervention is that interaction, that behavior between the adult and the kiddo or kiddos. And so we have to be prepared, strong systems to support that grown-up. So we're going to go to our next slide. Something to keep in mind is for my academic RTI and my PBIS folks, if we click one more time, we can see we have this overlap of components or core features. So we know that some of us feel as though we've been told and taught this is a dichotomous type approach. However, it's not. If we look back to guidance from Kent Nakatosh and Steve Goodman in a very fun and interesting book to read, we're really interested in this stuff in the green zone. This is the way, these systems are the way that we focus on adults to enable adults to use best practices. But that happens actually in a period of stages. So Lori's going to advance us to our implementation stages. And then at one point, there'll be a funny story about why is Lori advancing the slides. So just as a reminder, and this is a little bit of a differentiated instruction for those of you on the call. So some of you will say, I don't want to hear about stages. And some of you are like, yes, thank you. Implementation is a process. And this is a way of letting you take a deep breath and relax around this. This is a process. It's not an event. And this process is marked by stages. There are stages of how we do this work. And this takes time and effort. So implementation and getting up to speed where you're going to see the benefits, all of the benefits of this work is a bit like exercise, where we're exercising every single day. If you decide tomorrow you're going to start lifting weights, you don't all of a sudden then like bust your sleeves and be able to pick up your car, correct? It is a process that takes time. And we actually have various implementation stages. So we've got a hyperlink there at the bottom if you'd like to read in depth, but Lori's going to advance us to our next slide of implementation stages, just as a quick word. When we get started in this work and we're thinking about it, we're in a process of exploration. We are assessing resources, our capacity, and if this is a match for us. We jump, and then if we decide it's a go, we get into this installation stage. And installation is kind of a dangerous space because we start to think, oh, maybe I don't really want to do this. Change is hard. And we often see in the field that this stage can start getting a little stagnant. When we push through and we get to that initial implementation, we have things starting to move and we're starting to see the benefits. And then that full implementation is where we start to see we have our really robust fidelity, and we start to see the benefits of whatever we're implementing. And I say whatever we're implementing because the implementation stages and the research around this was completed through the National Institute, the National Implementation Research Network, NIRN, and they actually looked beyond schools. They looked at installation of an innovative practice in any public sector. And we see that these stages happen regardless of the field in which you're working. So for those of you who want to geek out, go ahead and check out that activeimplementation.org website. And for those of you getting started, remember this happens in stages, and we shift our tasks, our assessments, our action planning steps, as well as our resources based on where we are in this process. We do not build this overnight. So we're going to move on to our next slide here. I'm doing pretty well with my slides. So with that in mind, we're going to look at the core features of MTSS, but we're going to actually look at it through a trauma-informed MTSS, right? So, or trauma responsiveness in a multi-tiered system. Thanks, Cher, for giving me that language. So when we have our core features, and we want to make sure that right now we are attending specifically to the needs of folks who are experiencing toxic stress, trauma, big T. And we have, on top of just the typical, man, this is a pandemic and it's really scary because there's so much uncertainty, we have huge issues around equity that contribute to this, right? So when we're thinking about being responsive to this level of stress and trauma through MTSS, we take these core elements of multi-tiered systems. So we take effective district leadership team, and we think about the extent to which we need to expand it, make sure it is representative. So at this point in time, we are actually hearing the voice of families, of students, of our mental health practitioners, of the folks in the community, that this is not an insular perspective. We're taking consideration the perspectives of the folks that are being impacted by this work. That gets translated into our policy. So we may actually step back out and re-examine our mission statement, re-examine our values at this point in time, specifically to address the impact of toxic stress and trauma. When we're looking at our evidence-based practices, again, this is a district leadership team task, is to examine and have a protocol for pulling at evidence-based practices. Our attention shifts to auditing our current practices that promote mental health and mental well-being, and that mitigate trauma and respond to stress. And we're also concerned about the integration and alignment of additional practices. So what is currently going on? What currently do we have? Do we have an alignment here? And this is something I just have to point out, that shaming and isolation are not evidence-based practices. Failing a kid because they fail to show up on Zoom meetings, that's not an evidence-based practice. I get to say that because I don't work in any of your districts, so then I can be the mean person. But it's not just about implementing evidence-based practices, but a lot of our trauma responsiveness is also pulling out practices that erode relationship, erode trust, erode belonging, or promote shaming and isolation as a systematic response to behavior. And of course, all of these things funnel into this professional development that we provide to our staff, our administrators, everyone interacting with our kiddos and families and each other, that promote mental health, mitigate trauma, etc. These things get filtered into our action plan. We have actionable items. It's very, very important. And we evaluate this for fidelity and impact. We're going to talk a little bit about evaluation at the end, but this is just as a word there. So what needs to shift on our next slide? Do we really need to rethink that mission statement right now? Is that something, and this is, go ahead and take a few notes, think about this, and then my next slide is actually going to give you a moment to reflect, but go ahead and take some notes. You can also comment to the panelists if that will help you typing in there. But we're going to use our fidelity and outcome measures. We're going to assess where we are to think about, do we need to rethink our mission statement, to discuss an action around this? Do we need to expand our district leadership team? What does professional development and coaching look like right now? And this is not, we're not adding 50,000 things to your teachers or to your plate. We're saying, how do we support our teachers? How's professional development right now supporting what's going on right now? And how does that shift when we're thinking about trauma responsiveness? Lori and Cher have some great examples around that. My job's the systems piece. How do we evaluate this? And remember, our changes are based on our stages of implementation. Hashtag, we can't do it all at once, right? We cannot do it all at once. And when we're trying to do it all at once, that's when we burn out, we leave our jobs, we have less energy and patience for joy. We use our research-based assessments to help us prioritize, and you also use the input and support of technical assistance providers in your region who are invested in building capacity. So we're going to advance to our next slide, and this is where I want you to take a deep breath. You're going to see this slide a lot because this is kind of our mantra. We want you to assess where you're at, prioritize, what do you have the capacity to do? That translates into an action plan that we all know, we can find, we write in, we update. From that action plan launches us into doing, and then we assess again. I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to pass off to my trusty colleague, Lori.
All right, thank you. Yeah, the funny and not so funny story on why I'm advancing the slides is, first Jessica's computer was crashing, and then we moved it over to Cher's, and she couldn't see, then her buttons for Zoom wouldn't show up. And so then I started doing it, and as Kelsey was talking, my sound totally cut out. So now if I don't advance the slides quickly, one of them texts me to forward it. So it's the funny and not so funny.
It takes a village.
Oh my gosh, yes. And my heart almost stopped when I couldn't hear Kelsey. So before we get into action planning for next year, right, and building up these supports and what it might look like when we come back next year, we do want to take a minute to make sure people have resources and ideas for how do we celebrate our kids now, and how do we wrap up the year end really nicely. Like a lot of you, I've got 2 kids home right now, and they love any connection time with their class and their teachers. And I know that my daughter's elementary schools is doing a lot of fun ideas for how to wrap up the year and make it feel special. But if that's not something that you've put time into, we would encourage you to make sure that you're doing this. This is a couple of quick fun ideas. We'd love to hear from you. The survey that we're going to be sending out will ask you for ideas that your schools or districts are doing. And when we come back together on June 4th, we'll be sharing more of these fantastic ideas. So we're going to take you into what would it look like, a starter plan. And I say starter because this is a way to kind of launch our 6 weeks with a lot of extra support for our staff and for our kids. But we want to make sure we also have something that continues across the year. When I start to show you these examples that we're going to walk through, these are examples we see when a school has all of these practices fully built out. And I want to just caution you on that because I don't want you to see this and think that's too much and we can't do it. I want you to look at it and to say, wow, if we don't have these things going on, what are a couple of these that we really feel like we could do well next year that we could take and put into place? Okay, so know that when we look at these are my schools that have done this work for 10, 12, 15 years. But I want you to be looking for the ways that all of this focuses on relationships, on connecting with kids, and on building community. So a 6-week plan, we're gonna look here at this first slide, it's the first 3 weeks, and these weeks build on one another. So once we've started to practice in week 1, we're still carrying it over, but we're introducing some new things. across each week. And you can see there's some things that stay on there for these first 3 weeks, especially the first 2 bullets, that we're working a lot on getting to know our kids by name, strengths, and needs. And I borrowed that term from Susan Enfield, who is a superintendent in one of our Washington area districts. The other thing we're doing is we're really systematically teaching, modeling, and practicing school-wide and classroom expectations. We're not reading expectations from a sheet and hoping kids remember them. We're taking them out. If we're learning about the hallways, we're physically walking the hallways, we're practicing the activities. So this is really key that you have these things going on. You can see a couple of the other pieces that are in this week 1. You might be doing something like a class charter, which is really putting out our agreements. How do we want to act and be in community with one another in our classroom? You may be doing community circles for restorative practices. And if that's something you're wanting to learn more about, we have an online restorative practices training that will be coming up later in the summer that we'll be taking people through. That's ideally a training you do in person, but we'll be introducing some of that. You might be teaching kids skills like mindfulness and calming, because we know kids are going to be coming in with a lot of these traumatic experiences, and knowing things like, how do I do my deep breathing? If you were with us last time, how do I go through and use my feel-good plan that Cher demonstrated to us, right? These are good strategies for everyone to know. And then doing a lot of community building, whole school, classroom, cross classroom. And you can see we're starting to talk to kids about the academic goals they can expect to learn, but we're really not getting into the academics for the first few weeks. You'll see where that starts to come in on the next slide. And as you look across the week, you can see some of the things we could potentially be building in. If you're familiar with zones of regulation, that's a great curriculum. I see it used across pre-K-12 for kids really being able to assess where they're at and use some of those regulation skills. We might be teaching kids the way that we do class problem solving. Again, if you're using restorative, it's got a nice model built in for doing that problem solving. You may be jumping into things like the bystanders program, doing some bullying prevention work. And you can see that we're starting to do some diagnostic academic work to see where our kids are, but we're really focused on community building, not on starting the academic work. This is going to be a really hard message for some of your schools because there is a panic around the academic instruction time we've already lost. I will tell you though that if you slow down and build community, you will be able to take kids further and faster academically once you've done this work. We've seen this happen again and again with schools, so we know how critical this is. As we start to build into weeks 4, 5, and 6, you can see then we're building up from what we've already worked on. We might be looking at things as we get into week 4, like examining which kids do we not feel like we've been able to build a good relationship with yet. Maybe we're using a simple strategy like the 2x10. And if you're not familiar with that, if you just looked it up online, you'd find it. It's basically spending 2 minutes a day for 10 days, focused on just getting to know that kid and you know, kind of what makes that kid tick. We might be working on starting to use some of those academic routines we're learning in week 3 to move into whole class projects, starting to examine how our kids work together. I'm going to start shifting if I'm doing my restorative. You can see I'm going to start making my students the kind of circle keepers or the facilitators of the circle. So I'm handing that off of myself onto the students, pieces of that academic content, right? Slowly and integrate it throughout that SEL. So we've started to introduce our social emotional learning. We may be doing something like character trait of the week. And we're going to start to really do an integrated time. I want to stress, and I think Cher mentioned this last time, that the SEL time is not a break time for our teachers. when we're doing social emotional learning, hopefully the teachers are engaged in teaching it with kids. And if not, they're actively in the classroom learning it with the students. We want them to really be modeling and integrating these skills. And you can see we're also starting to do a couple of things as we move into weeks 5 and 6, where we might be surveying our students, our families, our larger communities on how do they feel like we've done rolling out the school climate and our school climate efforts. We may be starting our universal screening. That's pretty typical about 6 weeks into school, that we're going to be doing some universal screening, helping teachers to look at, are there students in need of a tier 2 or potentially tier 3 level intervention? So we're starting to try to do some of that early catch. If you want information on screeners, I'm happy to share some of that. You can email me or contact me through Megan. What I want you to think about as you looked at that 6-week plan, and we can send that plan out to you. It's on our soundsupportsk12.com website. It's one of the top things under our resources list is that plan. Can you see the integration of trauma-informed practices, social emotional learning, school connectedness, how we're building in predictability and consistency for kids? And can you see how systems need to be built or refined for these? Remember, the systems were what allow the adults to carry out the work for the students. We want to give you just a minute to reflect. As you looked at that list, what things were popping out to you, and which systems do you already know that you need to build out or refine around these? So take a minute, jot it down. All right, so now we're going to jump in and we're going to start talking about some of these pieces a little bit more, and then giving you resources. So if this is a place you need to focus, we're going to give you some resources that will help you do that. So I'm going to turn it over. I think, Jessica, you're starting off with this and then handing off to Cher.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Laura. You can advance us to our next slide. So my team here realized how I am such an externalizer. They agreed, probably secretly, to allow me to have more slides to talk through, but I appreciate that. So as a reminder, these are the components Cher introduced last week in a very clear way. Our components of trauma responsiveness is that we are creating the safe, predictable, and positive environment, right? We are setting kiddos and adults for success. It's predictable, safe, and positive. We are creating explicit opportunities to teach and provide feedback and support this development of self-regulation. We're explicit about that work. We're not hoping it's something that people, kind of pick up. And it's an environment that's very dense with positive relationships. And this is what all of us need. This is not just for our kiddos. If you're thinking right now about the work you've been doing with your colleagues, and what is one of the things that's been helpful and a source of strength for you, many of you would say relationships. So this is back to just another reminder is that we're working very hard right now, living in kind of almost a Groundhog Day of now. At the same time, we're trying to plan for the unknown. What will happen when it's time for school to begin again? I appreciated Lori's reminder for celebrating this time now, celebrating this year, because we're kind of stuck in this kind of cognitive emotional dissonance between the repeating of now and trying to plan ahead for something that's unpredictable. So when we're thinking about the stressors of that, offsetting some of that by celebrating the now, focusing on the positive, focusing on the relationships, we're dosing that up, right? We're going to dose that up. That's our multi-tiered concept, is that we can not only create this foundation of positivity, but we can increase and layer predictability, layer positive experiences, layer more relationships. We can do more of that. So I wanted to take us into a little bit of don't know if it's exactly a controversial issue, but it's a fun thing to talk about, is that I'd like to talk about grading, this idea of grading in a trauma responsive mode, which of course is inextricably linked to equity. So you may have seen this quote online. I actually lifted it from Kurt Hatch wrote a really great blog post for us that's hyperlinked on our next slide. But we realize a lot of us went into this situation of the pandemic realizing this existed, and it's been exacerbated. If we're assigning grades right now, we are really grading privileged, and we've been doing that, let's be honest, before the pandemic. And right now it is so obvious that we're grading more so on access to technology, security, ableism, housing. We are grading privilege. And so if we're going to tackle this topic, and we're going to advance to the next slide, we've got a hyperlink in here of this really great blog post by Kurt Hatch. If we're going to tackle the idea of grading, and we're going to actually walk the walk and talk the talk and be responsive to trauma and stress, even through our grading decisions, then we've got to have some kind of hard conversations here. If we are fine with the status quo and we're fine with the way things had been, then we get to keep doing that. If you're on this webinar today and other webinars saying we have to do better, we can do better, then I'm going to invite you to go down this rabbit hole a little bit with me. I've got some talking points, and I'm going to invite my other panelists to jump in and help shape the conversation as well. But if we think about our district team and the decision for grading during the pandemic, okay? In order to address this decision, we're actually going to have to get beyond our district team, the current makeup that we have. And we have some great examples. OSPI had some really fabulous conversations early in April, inviting focus groups and inviting input from different groups that represented mental health, family, students, the range of districts, the range of decision makers. So instead of maintaining that kind of singular status quo, this is how we make the decisions, they look to the big picture of who benefits and who is impacted. And are those equitable? Are those harmful, right? They asked those questions. This is where they kind of stepped back out and looked at some data, right? So we had this data for decision making. If you haven't seen Chris Reichdahl talk through the decision around grading, it's posted on the OSPI YouTube channel. I think it's worth your time. He pulled up data. He looked at the current distribution of grades in Washington prior to the school building shutdown. And in there could look at how many kiddos would be impacted if we decided it's either an A or an F. It's either everything or nothing. Or we're going to give an incomplete. What does that look like? The evidence-based practices, we leaned on those, not just Chris, but others making this decision, leaning on evidence-based practices. And remember, I said before, not really tongue-in-cheek, but a little snarky because I'm a bit of a brat, is that there's no shaming or isolation practices or harming practices that are evidence-based for long-term robust behavior change, right? And we know, given the fact that we are grading privilege and access, that if we are giving Fs, if we're giving incompletes to kiddos, we are harming them, right? And it's based on something over which they have no control. All of this leads to our professional development and feedback. So we have all this kind of background work that we're doing as a district before we hand off and provide professional development to our administrators and our principals. So I'll give it a non-example. So we want our administrators to have professional development around what does our grading look like? And the other part of that is, what does it look like when we come back to school if we've received that F or that incomplete? What does it look like? How do we know, how are we going to support those families and those kiddos, right? Support them emotionally, support them to get the work done. We don't want emails coming out. Here's an example from a principal that reminds families, if you don't show up, you get an incomplete. And then when family asks, and then what? Or what's the metric for incomplete? Or how do you help us when we get back? The principal says, I don't know. That's not supportive. So we have all of these different things that we are going to keep in mind as we expand our work to encompass trauma responsiveness, and to actually be looking through that filter, and not inadvertently, actually, because they're linked. We're actually also addressing these very large issues around equity and access. And the last I looked, I haven't seen anyone's mission statement that said we will only harm kids if they really deserve it, or we will only harm kids that we don't like, right? Our mission statements or our policies reflect a commitment to all children. So we actually have the opportunity at this time to reshape some of our work, or a lot of our work, to be much more attuned to the equity needs, the disproportionality, as well as our mental health needs. I'm going to give folks a moment to think about that. We're going to skip over to the next slide, and I'm going to see if any of our other co-hosts have additional thoughts or questions. If you have questions, if that little maybe diatribe, I don't know, if that prompted any thoughts or questions, please do put them in the question pod. And before we move on to talking about some really great resources for trauma responsiveness, I'm going to invite you to look back and think about this process of assessing, prioritizing, action planning, actually doing it. A lot of us, we just jump right to the do, but I'm going to slow you down, and then assessing the impact of that. And then I believe, I'm hoping, Cher will take us on through our resources here and social emotional learning.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank
Hello,
you.
everyone. I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time on the last slide talking about assessment of trauma-informed practices. So we can assess where we are in becoming trauma-informed by mapping out the 3 components that Jessica referred to earlier, and by plugging in what you already have in place that falls under those components. Do you have reset or calm down stations in place at elementary, or wellness rooms at the secondary level? Do you allow students to have appropriate fidgets? Do you practice zones of regulation or other SEL curriculum? These all support building skills for self-regulation. Consider these components are not just for kids. The staff need this nervous system support as well. And I'll speak to that a little bit more later in this section. Do you implement MTSS so that you can create a safe, predictable, and positive environment? Do you have restorative practices in place to build positive relationships and support skill building with students who have misguided behavior? What other practices do you have in place to build relationships with students and with colleagues? Next, you can create an action plan, including professional development on the topic. Work with your PBIS, race and equity, and building leadership teams to map out training for staff on trauma, toxic stress, and how to navigate challenging behavior that can result from those experiences, so the teams can integrate their practices. Utilize these teams' resources, like their time and expertise, to review policies and practices, and the environment for small changes that can be made at the same time the teams are also focusing on big changes, such as the race and equity work. PD can be broken up into shorter PDs that focus on building the self-awareness and skills for the adults, and then how to transfer those skills and knowledge to the school community. Culturally responsive teaching is trauma-informed. Racial oppression is a childhood and adult trauma, so when we choose to do our personal anti-racism work, we're also supporting a trauma-informed environment. If you're interested in beginning or furthering that work for yourself, please email me, and I'm happy to pass along resources I've used in my own work. My contact info is on the last slide. These next slides focus on free professional development opportunities where you can learn more about trauma-informed practices. The first 2 slides are school-related, and then the final one is an organization. It's organization-focused, but can be very applicable to the school setting. So we've got these two slides, and then the next one of Trauma-Informed Oregon. This is a resource that I really find valuable. They have a really well done infographics, as well as some free professional development modules that you can access. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to have you go one more. Thank you. So here's that slide again that you should be very familiar with at this point. So what do you already have in place as far as social and emotional learning goes? Just like we suggested for mapping out what you have in place under the 3 components of trauma-informed care, you can dive even deeper and do the same for social and emotional learning. You can map out what you already have in place under the 5 CASEL social and emotional competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Or you can use OSPI's competencies, which has the addition of self-efficacy. What opportunities are there to teach skills for that build these social and emotional competencies like whole body listening, focus, and self-regulation? Do you have those reset stations that I just mentioned? Do you allow the fidgets? Do you allow kids to move around the back of the classroom? Or do you have that wellness room for planned breaks? Is this something that you're interested in? And if you want to learn more about trauma and behavior, I highly recommend, there's in the resource section of the slides, you'll see a link for a Hillsborough School District Wellness Center. And it's a manual that the district uses to train folks on creating a wellness room in the building. It's also one of the best pieces of literature I've seen out there to teach and implement trauma-informed practices. Next slide, please. So implementing social emotional is not the new shiny thing. It is the thing and needs to be done with fidelity. Often, the social and emotional learning and academics are siloed from each other, meaning schools use a curriculum with lessons taught once a week, and there's little to no integration into the rest of the day or week. This approach helps, but is not best practice. It does little to effectively teach these skills, and staff and students are missing out on valuable learning opportunities when taking this approach. I include staff because these competencies of self-awareness, self-management, self-efficacy, social awareness, social management, and social engagement are life skills. We work our entire lives to develop and practice them, and the more skilled the adults are in these areas, the more likely the students will be or learn to do the same. The MTSS framework shows us what we need, that we need to have a tiered behavior supports alongside tiered academic supports. Social emotional learning is a PBIS Tier 1 intervention, something all staff and students should have access to. For example, feel-good plans, which I mentioned in the last webinar, are a step in the process to navigate emotions in a healthy way. Every social and emotional curriculum has a lesson or several lessons on self-regulation, and the feel-good plan is a way to take that information and explicitly and intentionally teach this foundational skill. Social and emotional learning can happen in just a few minutes per day throughout the day. It can be modeled and taught proactively and reactively, meaning you're going to proactively teach the concept to students, allow them time to create home and school feel-good plans, for example, and then you, meaning kids and adults, take brain and body breaks throughout the day. Feel-good plans give choice to students. And what is often negatively impacted by stress and trauma is a sense of empowerment that comes from having appropriate choices. An adult or child who feels powerless is unable to instruct and learn, so building in opportunities for choice and voice builds resilience. Once you've taught the concept and proactively practice it, then you'll have the strategy handy for reactive times when challenging behavior crops up. You can encourage all students, not just pointing to the one or few students with misguided behavior, to use their feel-good plans. This can help the students who are meeting expectations soothe their nervous systems when others' behavior doesn't feel so good. We don't want to talk at kids and say, use your feel-good plan in either a regulated or even dysregulated way. We want to encourage choice and critical thinking and self-awareness so we can ask questions like, what do you want to pick from your feel-good plan? So the how to teach social emotional learning throughout the day is to simply be intentional in your planning and in your handling of opportunities that present themselves. meaning you can proactively plan in teaching opportunities and reactively see all of the many opportunities to use restorative practices and teach social emotional learning throughout the day. Proactively, you can role play issues with kids might encounter at recess or lunchtime or doing group work. This includes at the secondary level, which they can get awkward and silly with it, but it's still really fun. You can teach the skills kids need to be unafraid to make mistakes or ask a question, such as helpful self-talk, raising a hand to ask a question, or connect with you during SAS time. Don't worry about taking time away from academic material. You will be focusing on creating psychological safety for kids so they are more likely to overcome their academic challenges. Name the skills you're working on so kids understand the intent and they experience the positive impact of that time. The adults create the context for kids, and it's our obligation in this field to create both physical and psychological safety so students can demonstrate their assets and strengths. The same concept applies to us adults. As colleagues, we need to create psychological safety for each other so we can work through conflict and mistakes, take risks, and stretch what we believe is possible for us and our students. Integrating social emotional learning into everything you do simply begins with asking yourself an empowering question. How can I teach these competencies? As opposed to the statement we often make that keeps us stuck and in our comfort zones, which is, I can't because ... So remember, it's possible, it's necessary for learning and growth, and the question to ask yourself is, how can I in any real life situation? If you'd like to dive deeper into this, there's a link in this slide to our colleague Carol Froge's institute. It's in our summer institute. It's her class on integrating social and emotional learning competencies in academics. Next slide, please. So we know that kids learn by observation, repetition, and imitation. So it behooves us as adults to consistently grow our confidence in our own social emotional skills by increasing our competence through skill building, meaning they are watching you more than they are often listening to you. This is not the do as I say, not as I do generation, which is how I was raised, because we know so much more about behavior and learning now. One of the opportunities for adult social and emotional professional development here that's listed on the screen or on the slide was created by me and Dr. Angela Brooks, and you can find out more information at anchoredsel.com. Also, don't forget about caregivers, especially now that they are juggling so many roles. There are lots of online parent education opportunities and parent support. One of the great resources there is through Positive Discipline, which has a local entities in each of our states. So we can't also expect more of our students regarding their success than we're willing to give ourselves as far as effort and commitment to learning. And we model a growth mindset when we acknowledge the need for continual improvement. As adults, we can constantly be learning and growing, which helps us guide students and positively impact students in the school community, as well as increase our own emotional and physical health. This job is wildly rewarding and meaningful. At the same time, it's extremely difficult. We can make it easier on ourselves by taking care of ourselves, by intentionally focusing on building our own resilience. The goal is to develop skills to make the job more sustainable and enjoyable, so we will take care of ourselves and be ready to take care of our kids. In turn, we model and teach resilience to our kids. Next slide, please. We can support each other and then support our students by becoming a champion of this work in our roles. Be a voice advocating for trauma-informed practices training in your building and district, remembering that we need to champion trauma-informed work alongside our race and equity work. We should be continuously assessing the effectiveness of our work because it's validating of our efforts, and we can see what is working and what isn't and tweak and pivot as needed. We can also be learning how to do this work better. Some tools for assessing how to focus on social and emotional learning is going to be an assessment like the Professional Quality of Life Measure, which is linked here, and looking at staff attendance and engagement data to inform our decision making. Also look at staff turnover. Look at several data points to move you in the right direction. Also consider the platforms you've established for you to get feedback and information from staff, student, and families. What do they need the most right now and in the near future? Creating some simple surveys that are translated into different languages so you can, as much as possible, capture as many voices as possible. Communicate, communicate, communicate your efforts. Stay in front of your families. Make your communication concise and purposeful without overwhelming folks. I like to use the example of one of my kiddos. My youngest is in middle school, an 8th grader, and his principal has excellent communication. I want to read it because it's not too often. She's encouraging and she speaks from a trauma-sensitive lens. And I know that the information she puts in there is important for me to read. So consider the same parameters for your communication with families. Next slide, please. Head to this site, schoolguide.castle.org, for more support for your social and emotional efforts. And then the next slide. Thank you. So let's reflect for a moment. What are some of the takeaways that you have from the sections on trauma responsiveness and SEL? What do you want to pay attention to right now? Consider small, teeny tiny shifts. We don't want to bite off big chunks of work at this time because our nervous systems can't handle it as well. So consider teeny tiny shifts that you can make and how you're thinking, feeling, saying, and doing about this work. What are the things that you can use to assess and prioritize this work? And I'm going to go back to Jessica to close us out today. Or is it Lori next?
It's me. Yep.
Lori.
Again.
Okay.
So just a couple of things around school connectedness, and I'll provide you a resource. You know, the keeping kids connected in the school is a multifaceted approach when we look at it. One of the biggest pieces that I'll emphasize here, when you look at these 4 top boxes, a lot of this is about effective engagement. We often look at school about, is a kid behaviorally engaged and are they academically engaged? But it's really about effective engagement and cognitive engagement. And that effective engagement is that piece that says, I belong here at school. This school is meaningful to me. I want to come here every day. That's the environment we're really trying to create when we look at this connectedness piece. A great resource around that, it's a little bit old, but it's still fantastic, is this resource that you can find at cdc.gov. If you just went there and typed in fostering school connectedness, we have it in a resources page we're going to be sending out to you as well. But just a nice, concise document. Another big piece around school connectedness is that restorative process. So if that's something you're just starting to look into, here's 2 books that I would recommend. They're both cheap, they're fast reads, they're good ones to maybe get a team of 6 or 7 people at your school together, do a summer book read, do some exploration. If you're looking for more resources around restorative, contact us and we can share those as well. When we look at this again, come back and really look at, do I know if kids feel connected in my school? And if not, what are some measures I could do? Looking at your school climate measures, doing some simple questions around, do kids feel connected to the building, connected to their teachers? Do they have good peer relationships? So assessing, prioritizing, action planning, doing and assessing. And then increasing your structure and predictability. This so much to me is that PBIS part about predictable, consistent, positive, safe. We're really trying to get those 4 big goals across the day. And the main ways we do that is, how do we maximize predictability for our staff and for students? We have really clear expectations. And this is the same for the adults as the kids. Clear expectations for the adults. What does it look like for them to be successful in our building and whatever their role is? We really maximize that student to teacher proximity, and we use that active supervision. And again, if any of these are resources you want more on, let us know. But it is about, when I'm working that school, that large cafeteria, that recess, my classroom, Am I moving? Am I scanning? Am I positively interacting? And am I praising kids? Really trying to hit that 5-to-1 level, making sure kids know when they're doing the right thing, right? We want to catch them at a high rate. And thinking about some ways to expand this, if you're already implementing PBIS and you have this commonly used behavior matrix to help guide expectations for kids, here's one that's a staff model. So this is the staff side of what I want kids to do. So if I want kids, for example, to always use the bathroom sign in and sign out system, then my adult expectation is that they're teaching that system to kids. If I want to make sure that my kids are on time and lined up ready to catch the bus in the afternoon, I want my adults out there and I want them to stay with their kids until that bus leaves. So we've got really clear expectations for the staff that help the kids meet those expectations. Anything we're going to ask of kids, we want the staff to be able to do and to model for us. If we have staff members who aren't holding to our expectations, aren't teaching and reteaching and reviewing these expectations, it starts to devalue that system. So if you felt like that has slipped off a little bit, that would be a place you may want to go back to and get that recommitment from. If you feel like you're having some issues around that, and it might also tie into perceptions around behavior and whose responsibility is that, there's a great tool that we can link you to that's called the Staff Perceptions of Behavior and Discipline. And that will be in our resource page. Here's another example of the matrix where you can see up top in the white. These are our kid pieces. And then you can see at the bottom, here's our teacher roles. They're setting those conditions for learning. So again, when you look at those pieces, you know, assessing and prioritizing at the school level using the tiered fidelity inventory, which you can find on pbis.org. At a district level using the district fidelity inventory, those can help you really assess and strengthen that predictability and consistency for kids. So take a moment, write down a couple of to-dos around this, and then Jessica's going to close us out with how do we really evaluate these systems.
Thank you, Lori.
Yes.
Can you skip us to our outcome system data practices slide? So I wanted to pull up this slide. I know this is actually an older Venn diagram, but I wanted to pull this up because I wanted to point out our outcomes is the backdrop. It is all of the things that we do, all the systems we build for adults to do their job well, the practices we put in place to take care of our kiddos, to create those nurturing relationship-based environments where they're successful and to respond to need. And then the measurement we use, the evaluation, those are all governed by our outcomes, right? We're trying to achieve those outcomes. Everything we do within those circles is pointing us in the direction of our outcomes. Essentially, we're going to skip the next slide and go right to slide 69 to essential questions. Essentially within our work, we've done when we've done that alignment and pulling back out, are we going to actually implement a trauma responsive school, distance schooling or back to school? When we do that, we're asking 2 essential questions with our evaluation. And some of you are getting sad because I'm talking about evaluation. Some of you are cheering because I'm talking about evaluation. It doesn't need to be extremely complicated. We're asking 2 big questions. Now throughout, Cher has mentioned some really helpful assessments. Lori has mentioned a few. And the idea is that anytime we're going to ask, we're going to be thinking about evaluation, we're couching it under, are we doing what we said we were going to do, which is fidelity? And then the second number one is it having the intended impact? Is it impacting what we wanted it to impact? So is it creating a relationship-based environment? Are kids feeling that? Are teachers feeling that? Are they feeling safe? Do they feel like this is predictable? Our next slide is going to take us through, we have 3 slides in a row that take us through different types of measurement tools that we can be using. And first we have fidelity. So I said at the beginning, and Kurt said it as well, and that we really building these systems and strengthening what is weak will help us do a better job now and in the future. So we want to be taking a look at the fidelity, or are we doing what we said we intended to do? So we have district self-assessments. There are two different self-assessments you could use as a district. They're both fabulous. One's a little bit newer than the other. But our PBIS implementation blueprint includes a district self-assessment. We also have a pilot tool going on right now. It's fairly new, but it expands a little bit more, and it's the District Systems Fidelity Inventory. Don't let all the names or the acronyms fool you. The same core elements of multi-tiered systems of support that I pointed out before and that Cher and Lori have talked through, they show up throughout, right? We're learning the concept and the components of MTSS. We're not just memorizing bits and pieces. At that school level, we have the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or the TFI. This tells us how our systems are functioning at tiers 1, 2, and 3, or that we actually have them in place the way that we're supposed to. And last, but of course, the reason we do all of this intricate planning and organization is that we can look into those classrooms, we can use classroom observation tools to assess the dosage and the accuracy of those practices that are creating a foundation for having a trauma responsive approach, and are allowing us to layer up and dose up and build for our kiddos. So we have 3 different levels, if you will, of assessment for fidelity. The next slide, we talk about a little bit about perception data. Perception data are great. They kind of fulfill the fidelity and outcome side of those questions. So we have different types of assessment. One of them is spelled incorrectly. That wasn't me. The self-assessment survey is a perception and priority survey for teachers. To what extent do they perceive certain things are in place in the school environment? And then also, is it a priority of theirs to see that implemented stronger, to have more attention to it? We have staff perceptions of discipline and behavior. That actually comes from one of our UW colleagues that really, again, looks at the different types of how our staff are perceiving this. And it's kind of a bit around perception is interesting. It gives us a lot of insight to some of our systems. We have a personal assessment of SEL competencies for staff. We also have a professional quality of life measure. Cher had pointed this out. And then again, this classroom observation tools, we can use these as a self-assessment or as an observation that is done, kind of a formative observation that's done by our administrators or our colleagues or our coach in a school. Our last set of tools is our outcome data. And there are so many types of outcome data. Remember I said that we wanted it to be aligned with the outcomes we're really hyper-focused on right now, right? We're actually using the tools that help us say, are we making a difference for these things right now, having the intended outcome? So professional quality of life measure can give us, we can look at changes in that. We can look at changes in teachers' use of those classroom practices, right? Skill acquisition, the acquisition of skills by teacher is an outcome we're interested in. We can look at our school climate data. We have surveys for kiddos and surveys for teachers and surveys for families that can give us the outside perception, and we can look at those things changing over time as an outcome. And then of course we have gobs and gobs of student data. Gobs is an official research term. We have absentee data, which we keep on a regular basis. We can have our log-on data for Zoom and distance learning. I believe it's hailing at my house right now, if you can hear that. We can also look at something like nurses' visits for once we're back in brick and mortar, time out of class logs, feelings of belonging. We can have activities around those things. A morning meeting check-in scale on a scale of 1 to 3, how are kiddos feeling today? 1 is stinky, 3 is great. And of course we have many, many different iterations of academic data. We don't have to look at all things at once. We can really focus on a handful of things that still give us a view of the whole child, the whole student in front of us. But there's no law that says we have to measure every single thing all the time and spend all of our time creating Excel spreadsheets. Next slide is our steps we can take now. And we just have a few slides here left with some poll questions and some resources. But just to remind you that to share and Lori have been reminding you to identify what you already have in place. What are some tools you already have in place or things you can assess without being too much of a heavy lift? And for those of you just learning or not quite familiar with all of the ins and outs yet, we have a resource, we have a PDF that is hyperlinked that you can click on, and also you can email us and ask your questions. But when we think about our assessment tools, can we rely on those data? When we look at our fidelity and outcome data, are we actually sure they're being collected and reported with integrity? Are they being used? Are we just assessing and admiring? In our action plans, I want you to identify what you can work on right now, using as much data as you have available to guide your work. And really, staff meeting raising their hand or at a staff meeting or staff raising their hand or completing a quick survey, those are valuable data for you to use. If you don't have all the bells and whistles yet with the data system, I want you to think about low-hanging fruit. Now you can probably hear my children shrieking with excitement because they're running in the rain. I want you to think about low-hanging fruit. What are some things you can accomplish now quickly that will make a difference? What do you have the capacity to do? I know that if I could see all of your faces right now, that I would see a bunch of heroes in front of me. You have your little capes flying in the wind, okay? So you have amazing capacity, and I'm going to ask you not to work yourself into an autoimmune disorder or into a ground, okay? So I want you to think about what you have the capacity to do right now and what things are actually an emergency versus what things are things you would like to do. And then this is a little bit of a Rob Hornerism, is what is the smallest thing you can do to make the biggest impact? And again, if you're not used to thinking along those terms, you are on a webinar today with a group of people who are. And we have a Q&A session next week, or not next week, I'm making people nervous, on June 4th. Let's go to our next slide. So you can hyperlink, oh, I wanted to remind you, you can't do all of it at once. I already said that though. So, oh yes, that was just a reassurance for more deep breaths. We have a resource PDF. We've been pulling things into there. You can hyperlink there. And we have our next slide is our, just some emails, websites, connect with us, check out our website, see what we have posted there that you can download now. And if you're having trouble deciphering or kind of going through that, Kelty Schmitz reminds us it's a bit like drinking out of a fire hose sometimes with all the information that's out there. And while we shared a lot of information that may not on the outward all say PBIS or MTSS, we assure you that it can all be integrated. It clicks well together, and that's why we're sharing it with you. So let's do a quick check-in here for our next poll question number 5. We would like to know on a scale of 1 to 3 how helpful today's information was. So Kelsey is going to get that pulled up for us. Megan's reminding all of us in the chat pod as well that we have a clock hour documents that will be at the end of a survey. The survey is hyperlinked here in the chat pod for you to grab. And then we've been very good at sending out those emails and reminders. Well, look, no one said it was not helpful. Thank you so much. It was very good. Most of you said it was very helpful. It was only 3. We only gave you 3. Thank you for sharing that. Our next slide is going to be another poll because we'd like to know what other topics would be helpful. So what other topics would be helpful? This is going to help us with planning for June 4th. Integrating mental health and adult SEL. So great work. You are focused on the right thing. You've come to the right webinar. Really excited about that. As a reminder, as we advance to our next slide, if you have questions or comments, please bring your questions to the office hours session. We also have a hyperlink in a minute that's going to pop up that will take you to a survey. We have some helpful websites mapped out here for you to connect to. we're going to do a little plug here. We've got a really amazing, I'm so excited to collaborate with this group. We've got an amazing opportunity for a summer institute. We will be doing a day of a bunch of really great topics on August 13th. So mark your calendar. That'll be returning, rebuilding, renewing, and adapting tiered supports for the new now. A bunch of really great presenters. So mark your calendar. We're going to have that registration will be up and going in the very near future. I want to say thank you very much for being on the webinar today. You can connect with each of us here. We have the next Q&A session. Thank you for remembering to put our cameras back on, Lori. Oh, I should take off my sticky. If we advance the next slide, you'll see the date and the time for our next webinar. We have a tiny URL for you to submit your questions for the live session. You're welcome to ask in person. However, it will help us a lot if you do that in advance. There's our registration link. And if you have questions about that, please, of course, feel free to email Megan Lucy, who is extremely organized. We're very grateful for her. Other reminders about events that the MHTTC, or Northwest MHTTC, is offering. We advance to that next slide, we'll see. We have, there we are. We got a bunch of stuff going on. That was very, very formal language. There are so many things going on. I kind of can't keep up on all of it, which makes me really appreciative that it's being recorded. So we have a well-being series. You can click on the tiny URL and learn more about this. Here are some of the upcoming events and the events that are being recorded. A really well-rounded group of topics and some really phenomenal presenters.
Thanks to all the partners involved in this on behalf of AWSP. We're glad that folks are finding this valuable and hope to see you on part 3 of the series. And just a few takeaways that I remember, connections to being very intentional with our implementation plan. So we have fidelity, consistency, predictability. Cher talked about the need and importance for racial literacy and being embedded in this work, and just the power and importance of being intentional around building relationships and connectedness, specifically around how we establish and sustain and maintain positive relationships with students. So with that, Kelsey, I'll turn it back over to you for the Q&A.
Oops, I'm on mute. Okay, one of the questions, Kurt and others, feel free to chime in. So there was a question, is there any risk that if we don't hold our students accountable for their work and grade them accordingly, that we will be training them not to participate, practice, complete work, etc., if we find ourselves in this situation again in the future?
Sure, I can say a few things about that. It's a great question. My short answer, and this isn't even being sarcastic, but the short answer is really no, and it's based on conversations and some data that's come in from hundreds of different locations across Washington State recently, as we dove into the concept of grading during this shutdown. And we're really looking at doing a short solution right now that hopefully opens the door in a more broad way to the grading conversation that Jessica was talking about earlier. So I think part of the question is, are we using grades as a mechanism of compliance and to try to motivate kids through grades, which plenty of research has shown that it's actually the opposite. It does the opposite with student motivation. So are we doing it for compliance reasons or because of content? And we just know that right now, and I think I mentioned earlier, that we are not very proximal to the pain of so many students and families. So we don't know what station they're in life right now, other than to assume that they're going through a whole bunch. Unemployment, kids working instead of being able to do school. So the use of incompletes has to be done with so much grace, compassion, and care before we saddle kids with an incomplete. And just, there's one point that it keeps coming back. You know, there's millions of people right now that are giving federal funds of about $1,200 for free. And so maybe we think of this having kids be given A's or judiciously incompletes as a version of that. There's also, just real quickly, some statistic that came in from a large school district in Washington recently where the students, 9th, 10th, and 11th and 12th graders were asked if if their grades were converted to A's just for this time period, not for the whole year, would that be helpful? And 76, about actually 90 said that would be very helpful. The next question was, if you were provided an A for the remainder of the shutdown until school is out in June, at least here in Washington State, would you still engage in school? And 76% said very likely they would still engage. And another 17% said they're somewhat likely to engage. And in fact, kids are being pulled back into the school system when we're not using grades at this time. We're seeing engagement go up. And that was a pretty large sample. There was over 3,800 kids that responded to that survey.
That's great, Kurt.
Go ahead, Jessica.
I think it was a great response. I'm excited about that. And I wanted to say, just remind everyone, we made up the concept of grades. We didn't make up the idea of relationships. If you ask your kids right now what they miss and what's reinforcing about school, it's their teachers, it's their friends. We socialize kiddos as a mechanism for us to help them socialize with one another and reap the benefits of those relationships. So if we're thinking about grading and we're worried about the small proportion of kiddos, and we expect that triangle of response, right? We expect there to be kiddos who need that tier 3 level support and may respond in that way when it comes to grading. But if we back out and think about Maslow's hierarchy, what do we actually need, especially right now, we're going to say relationships. And we can surely make decisions around grading, especially during a pandemic, to honor one of the most basic needs that we have as humans.
And I just want to add to Jessica and Kurt that this may feel like a bit of a trust fall exercise for our nervous systems, meaning, we may kind of fall back on old systems that served us or not so much served us, because we're panicking and worried about the outcomes, and we don't know what this looks like, sounds like in the long term. But just focusing on how Jessica and Kurt responded will help, using your feel-good plans to soothe your own nervous systems, as this can feel very, awkward and just ambiguous. We need to use our adult SEL skills to just move us through this in the best possible way, be able to use those tools to help us step back and see the big picture of this experience, especially for our kids, because these long-term effects are going to be massive on our kids, and we need to minimize the negative effects as much as possible.
All right, fantastic. Just on behalf of all of us at the Smart Center and the participants today, I just want to extend a huge thanks to our experts for taking the time to present this great content, to provide amazing resources that you can take away and use today, and just being, great professional leaders in this work, and encourage you all to reach out to them if you need additional support or training or technical assistance. We're all just here to help, and we invite you to reach out to all of us, and hope to see you back with us for the Q&A session. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up, and hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.